talking with Mitch Greenhill, noted performer since the 1960s, also the author of 2 books, Raised by Musical Mavericks, and the one that we're going to be talking about today, which is called What Goes Around. Why don't you mention a little bit about your career and then just give us a little shot of what goes around?
Well, when I was 13 years old, my dad decided he wanted to present Pete Seeger in concert, which was a rather radical thing to do in 1957. And Pete stayed at our house, and then I was taken away by this new music. It was an impressionable time for me, and these were many powerful musicians. As indicated in the book, Raised by Musical Mavericks, recalling life lessons from Pete Seeger, Lightnin' Hopkins, Doc Watson, Reverend Gary Davis, and others. And I fell in with the Cambridge and Boston folk music scene, which was largely located around Club 47 in Cambridge, which is where I cut my musical eye teeth. And one thing led to another. I was in a band with Jackie Washington, played the Newport Festival, started touring around the East Coast and Midwest. The late 60s, I moved to California and fell in with the rock and roll crowd of Northern California, and spent some time there, then went into some country western bands, went back to Boston, played in some rhythm and blues bands. Then eventually I joined my dad's business and started representing musicians like Doc Watson, Taj Mahal, the Klezmatics, and others. And at the same time kept on performing, writing songs, releasing albums. I've released 9 albums, I think. And somewhere along the line I got it into my mind to start writing, and that's where we are today, I guess.
Well, why don't you give people a little shot? First of all, Raised by Musical Mavericks is a personal memoir, whereas this is a piece of fiction. And characterizing it, when I was explaining it to people, I said, well, this is a suspense novel that isn't exactly a mystery, but is written in a way that a person who enjoys mysteries might enjoy. There's a certain level of mysticism involved. I'm not sure how you would characterize it. How do you characterize this work?
I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's interesting. I'm always, as a writer, both for music and for prose, I'm always interested in how much to reveal and when. It's kind of a strategic decision you're always making. I actually, after I finished writing the Raised by Musical Mavericks, which I see as a kind of a coming of age story with a musical language. People who had known me in the 70s, my rock and roll days, were saying, well, why don't you extend it? Why don't you just write some of that stuff? And that is how I started. I started writing about my time in the 70s, but I wasn't really working for me. And I found that if I used fictional characters, I could get more into the meat of what I was trying to get across.
Why don't you give us a shot of a little of your fictional characters with a reading?
Okay. This is a little of the backstory of one of the characters, Reed Rosen, who's a guitar player. At this point, he's met the other main character, Angie Henderson, and they've fallen in love at a recording session, as never happens, but this is fiction, so here we go. And she's agreed to accompany him down the coast to his place in Venice. The next day finds Angie and Reed driving down the Big Sur coast, heading for Los Angeles and Reed's apartment in Venice Beach. She looks to her right at the ocean far below, where waves lap up against a rocky shore. Down there, a lone otter swims on its back while chomping on an abalone. Higher up, near the winding highway that the van is cautiously navigating, scrub oaks and sycamores cling precariously to the wind-swept shore. She turns left and looks at Reed, still trying to figure him out, wonders if she made the right decision to travel with him, or is she yet again acting impulsively, as when she jumped into his van and as when she joined the recording session. And she looks back at the built-in bed where they made love last night. It was so sweet and so intense and so inevitable after the recording session. The intimacy of that moment made everything before it seem like foreplay and made everything after seem like fate. But now, a few hours later, as the sun cuts through Big Sur's thick fog, Angie realizes she's in a car with a man whom she only just met. Yes, they communicated wonderfully yesterday in the recording session, making music, and last night making love. But now, no matter how deeply she intuitively feels that she knows the guy, it's time to be practical, time to learn more about him. So she begins, I've told you about myself, my time at Mills College studying with Subotnick, my work at the Black Panthers free breakfast program, my days with Sly and the family. Now, what about you? What brought you from wherever you started to a weird recording session that you saved from a bunch of sloppy hippies? Reed chuckles. You, babe, saved that session. I just hitched a ride on your fast-moving freight train. She smiles. Okay, compliment accepted, but now, spill. Reed takes a deep breath and launches into his story. I was a math major at UCLA, on track to a career in my dad's company, tax preparation. Helping people avoid taxes, actually. Midway through my sophomore year, the week before semester finals, I decided to go to the Ren Fair. The what? The Renaissance Fair, you know, where people pretend like they're living like 400 years ago with jousts and pumpkin pants and funny pouches. It was news to me, but go on. Well, anyway, I went. And just to make sure I got the full vibe, I dropped a tab of acid as I walked through the entry arch. And then boom, I got busted. Because of the acid? No, that was cool. I got busted because I wasn't in period costume. Nobody told me you had to come dressed like you lived in the Renaissance. Oh God. So there I was, spiraling into an acid trip, roped to a line of other screw-ups. They threw me in the goddamn stocks, you know, wooden ankle cuffs, for a fucking hour. You poor nutty kid. Then after they let me loose, somebody gave me some Renaissance clothes, pointed me along a dusty trail and said, proceed thee yonder. By now I was really tripping. By the time I rounded the first bend, I had left the 20th century behind and was, in my mind anyway, in the honest-to-God Renaissance. The first person I met was a girl, a fair damsel in a flowing white dress. A ring of flowers adorned her hair. She gave me an angelic smile, kissed me on the cheek, and went on her way. Then I was approached by a knight in shining armor on a giant steed. He wished me good day, sire, and doffed his helmet, said he was in a hurry to compete in a joust. But get this, around the next bend, I met the composer Josquin des Prez. Angie, not quite certain how to take this turn in the story, nonetheless plays along. Ooh, I love des Prez. She remembers the composer from her Renaissance music course at Mills. We had an amazing conversation. Methinks thou art a musician, he began. Well, I don't know, I replied. I think I'm involved with numbers. Just so, he said, and went into this long but wonderfully clear riff on Pythagoras. That was a name I knew from geometry, the triangle and all that. But des Prez hit me to Pythagoras' theories of musical intervals, how the overtones are all interconnected through harmonic relationships. By the time des Prez bade me farewell and disappeared, music, which had been a hobby that I loved, had become my life's calling. In that moment, I went from an amateur to a wannabe professional. Angie responds with a low whistle. Well, that's a story you don't hear every day. Didn't know I was riding with such a time traveler. But as for the amateur to professional stuff, I imagine you know that an amateur is one who does it for love. It's what the word means. We don't want to lose that. Right on, it's a calling, don't you think? Or a practice, like yoga or meditation. Totally agree. Anyway, long story short, I spiraled into music and out of college. Never got to my exams. I barely got back to UCLA, just long enough to grab my things. You dropped out of time? Reed ponders the question before venturing. Seems like I dropped into time. Time became a different beast, less rigid, more open. Okay, but you were totally with me at the session yesterday when we were stressing the two-hand beat. You seemed very precise. Yes, but when we reached that place where we were in the zone, you know where I mean, I forgot all about the two-hand beat and everything else. I've been there only a few times, but that's what I'm aiming for. That's why I'm a musician. Maybe I'm approaching a synthesis of my past two poles, precise time and open time. Synthesis, that's a word we used in the Panthers. Baby, you may be a Marxist after all.
Well, of course, speaking as someone who was working at the Renaissance Fair at about the period that you're writing about, I have to first be pedantic by noting that the Renaissance Fair started in the 1970s, and we were always doing it 400 years ago to the day, but Josquin de Prez would have been out of period because he died before that. I think he died in 1545 or so.
Well, in Reed's Acid Trip, Josquin de Prez is right there with the Renaissance.
But we always had people who showed up a little bit out of scene because, you know, they had the costume for a previous era and they were going to wear it, darn it.
Good enough. Yeah.
But I would love the idea that someone got their actual inspiration from this kind of thing. Do you know anybody who actually was inspired to love music by hearing it at the fair? Or?
The story of the guy dropping acid in the Renaissance Fair and not getting to his final exams is one that I cannibalized from my old buddy Ace White, whom I think you know from your time at the Renaissance Fair. We were talking about
yes.
The cheese sandwich place that my son was working at. And Ace, that was Ace's story. How he got to the Renaissance Fair anyhow to be very successful at it. Interestingly enough, as he was telling me this story, we were smoking a joint behind the cheese booth, and he had a time clock there. The guy who dropped out of time and wanted to make sure that anybody who was working for him was there on time and wasn't getting paid for when he wasn't there. So.
One of the odd things is that one of the things that is wonderful about the Renaissance Fair, that used to be when it was still good, was that there were all of these people who played all these arcane musical instruments, and this was the only place that anybody cared that you played your hurdy-gurdy or your medieval viol and all of these other instruments. And in fact, or again, something that was not probably in England at that time, but there was someone who was playing the Norwegian key fiddle.
I remember that. I actually used the Renaissance Fair hurdy-gurdy guy on an album that I produced around that time.
Well, the Renaissance Fair, then you probably didn't know something, which a lot of people didn't know until he was in his last days on Earth. The guy who was the Renaissance hurdy-gurdy player, whose name was Ethan James, used to be the keyboard player for the Vanilla Fudge. His secret love during the time that he was playing in the Vanilla Fudge, when he got money, was to buy medieval instruments. And after he made enough money playing rock and roll, he ended up out at the Renaissance Fair playing weird music. So, sorry, we got a little digression there away from your book, but
the book is full of digressions like that. We like that.
Yeah, that real life is full of digressions. That's what part makes your book seem very realistic, is that things happen to people for reasons that might seem trivial, but it sends things in a different direction. This book is a period piece in a way, and I just mentioned something that hit me because of the fact that I was in that place and at that time. How do you think this book would be received by people who are not familiar with the milieu of California in that era, for whom some of the little nuggets that you dropped in, they don't know where the fiction ends and where something that was real starts?
Well, that was always an issue to me as I was writing it. I wound up at the idea that I just had to get across that things were important. It's important that Reed get across Berkeley during the middle of the People's Park riots. Doesn't matter whether you really know the politics of the People's Park riots. You have to know that this is his obstacle. He's got to get there. And I pretty much treat every chapter like that. There's this obstacle at one point, somebody in a recording session, somebody comes up with a Neumann microphone. You don't have to know what a Neumann microphone is, but you have to know that it's important to the people who are involved with it.
Right. Because you believe that the author knows what they're doing, and therefore using that name, it's a name of power to the people involved.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, a lot of this does happen in recording sessions and backstage and other situations that you and I have both been to, but most people haven't. But you carry forward some of the tension that anyone who's ever been on stage knows about, where I've got a show that's starting in 5 minutes and I just don't know what to do with myself for 4 minutes and 55 seconds. And the general sense of frustration of any rehearsal that anybody's ever been in, where there's one person that just doesn't know their lines or doesn't know their tune or whatever else.
Yeah, there's I think there are 3 recording sessions in the book, and each one of them verges on the edge of total disaster. There's one there where it's Reed and Angie's big break. They're actually scoring a television commercial for a national car company, and the drummer might not show up on time. Then turns out Angie's written the chart a little wrong. The whole thing could just fall to pieces. At which point, their forward movement in the music business could come to a screeching halt, and. So we want to be with them as they navigate these pitfalls, and there are plenty in any recording session I've been to. There's one, I think I used it in the book. Somebody once said to me, these recording sessions are 80% boredom and 10% panic. And then Angie says, "What's the other 10%?" He says, "Well, that's what we're going to find out right now."
Well, it's a fair thing also to note that even if we haven't all been to a recording session, if we're reading an Ian Fleming novel, we haven't been in, a Cold War prisoner exchange. There's all kinds of ways in which authors put us in places we haven't been before, and that's part of an author's job.
That's why one of the reasons why I like to read fiction is to go these places that I haven't been to before.
But I have to ask you something, which is, you started out as someone who was writing lyrics, and I presume poetry. I presume you've written some pieces that you just never found a tune for, and they're sitting in a drawer somewhere, and it's like, well, it's not a song, so it must be poetry. And you now, after how many years of writing lyrics, you suddenly moved to narrative?
Well, okay, you got me there. I don't really understand that myself. I think actually the idea, as I said, I was writing my memoir, Raised by Musical Mavericks, kind of came in response to a number of people who had heard me kind of tell some of these stories and said you should write them down. You have this interesting story to tell, write it down, and so I did. And then, as I say, I started to do the new book, the similar as a nonfiction, and wasn't working. But as soon as I developed these fictional characters, it was very interesting. They would call out to me to play. It's like, can Mitch come out and play? Sometimes they'd call out to me in the middle of the night. I'd have to kind of paddle downstairs and listen to what they had to say. And it was kind of a fascinating relationship that I had with them. I don't actually talk to them anymore now that the book is out. I have to find other imaginary playmates. But it's kind of, I think, the way, like in the story of Noah, God has created these people and he's given them free will and they make terrible choices. That's kind of how I feel about my characters.
Lots of people have imaginary friends as a kid, but they don't get to kill them in public, which is kind of what they're doing here. Gotta ask though, you really had never tried to write anything other than lyrics before this? Not even, not essays, not journalism?
Oh no, I've written a bunch of album notes and liner notes and some essays. In fact, one of my liner notes won an award from the Bluegrass Music Association. When I entered college, I was an English major, and I had my eyes on writing then. I took a couple of creative writing courses, and I wasn't really happy with the product, what I was turning out, what I was creating, and everybody else in the class seemed to be so much better at it than I was that I kind of gave it up for a long time. But I've been a serious reader of fiction for many years, and I've always kind of felt that's part of, I don't know, my vocabulary in a sense. So I don't know, I guess if I had thought about it, and if I knew better, I probably wouldn't have done it. But half the things you do is because you don't know any better. So.
Now, most of your characters in this book have drug habits of varying seriousness that I think a modern reader encountering this would think were extremely decadent and obviously on the road to ruin. Although, I guess, is it that if you picked any random group of people in that age group and demographic, they probably would have also been using cocaine, weed, acid?
Well, cocaine is kind of a villain in the story, cocaine and cocaine leads people to tell lies and to do negative things. I think most of the people are casual marijuana smokers, and most everybody I knew in the 70s was a casual marijuana smoker. One of the guys, Hideo, one of the characters, doesn't take any drugs other than single malt scotch. And so there's a variance of what's going on there. But one of the characters, Sunshine, is a dealer, and that leads to complications.
I was just curious about the modern concern with glamorizing drug use or making any kind of link between drug use and creativity. That's almost a taboo in some circles, but it's also undeniably what was happening back in that era.
Well, like I say, most everybody I knew in the 70s did some drugs, and most everybody I know from that era doesn't do it anymore, and I don't.
They don't
find
do it any less, but they don't do it anymore.
Okay, and I don't find them any less creative, myself. Think of all the people who started using heroin because Charlie Parker used heroin, but didn't really help that much.
I'm not shocked that it didn't help. Never having tried that personally and not being inclined to, but yeah, that's a pretty horrifying idea of somebody trying heroin because it might make them like Charlie Parker. One thing that didn't happen in here, and that I was almost surprised by after I read the book, is that you portray people who are up and coming in the LA music scene, but you seem to have resisted the urge to do more name dropping, of having them playing along with other bands and, having Christine Cervenka from X, do a walkthrough on the novel, or somebody else who was there in that period during the punk section of the book.
Well, there are. I didn't use the real names in the punk session, but there are real people in this book. And there are people that I made up. In my earlier drafts, I had more real names, and then I kind of started replacing them. Anybody who might conceivably take offense, I guess. But there are people like Sly and the Family Stones there. When we get to the New Orleans section, George Porter Jr. is a real bass player. although everybody else in his band is made up. Ellis Marcellus makes a brief thing in there. It's one of the ways in which I'm kind of playing around with it. I just as soon have people trying to guess who's real and who isn't.
And that is a fun aspect of it. Can I ask about one other thing, which is that I don't know how much you want to reveal about this, but there is an item in the book that seems to have a mystical significance as it passes from hand to hand. And first of all, curious about whether you personally would identify yourself as having a set of mystical beliefs, a belief in the power of inanimate objects to change the world around them.
Personally, I don't. I'm a more practical, down-to-earth type of guy. But I actually brought a netski here. This is a genuine netski. It's not as elaborate as the one that's in the book. Netsuke is a Japanese talisman. It goes back hundreds of years, and you can see it. You kind of would put the belt of your kimono through there and tie it. And I have a good friend, a guy who actually I talk about in the memoir quite a bit, Steve Gardner, who had a world-class collection of netskis. I used to be fascinated by them. He would show it to me. And as a matter of fact, this is one of his old netskis, one of the few that stuck around. In the book, the netski maybe has supernatural aspects and maybe doesn't. It's I'll leave it to the reader to kind of figure that out, decide for himself.
I would say that you definitely create the feeling that whenever that particular object comes into view, something is about to happen. Something is about to change in a certain way. So it is an interesting kind of signal to the reader, something that the characters in the book don't know, but after a while the reader knows.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That's probably true.
You're taking the reader into a partner in the story in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. I like that. The book is called What Goes Around, and what goes around is the netski. It travels from one person to another, goes through just about all the characters, all the major characters in the book. And I won't reveal where it winds up, but at the end it's a bit of a surprise where it winds up.
Do you have any objects in your life that you can look at and say, here's an oddball thing that I've lost and it's come back, or that there's some similar kind of situation? Because it seems like the bonding with the object, the concept of the bonding with the object, seems like it might have been written from something personal. Or maybe that's just an author who's really good at conveying that. I think it's all from my imagination. I did have, you reminded me of I have this old guitar. It's a Gibson L1 from the 1914, I think is when it was made, and it got stolen at one point from me. And my bass player found it and had it returned to me, no questions asked. So that was and it still is. It still is. I play it every now and then. It's in my array of instruments. I have a tune for a high-strung guitar these days. I think musical instruments have that kind of power with me rather than other things. Now, are there any pieces of music that, while you were writing the book, something that you were writing about in the book inspired a piece of music that would be related to that would be related in some way, even if nobody but you gets that relationship? Well, there's one point where the characters talk about quartet at the end of time. Is that Messiaen? I've totally forgotten. And then there is a song that goes through the book. The Reed and Angie wind up at this recording session to record this song, and then it gets recorded again in another recording session, and finally gets played by a nurse on her ukulele towards the end. And I was thinking about writing that song, but I decided
venture it. Maybe someday I will, or maybe I'll find, somebody who writes hits to do it.
I have to admit that I was actually expecting, when I knew that someone who was a lyricist had written a book, I was thinking, every lyricist that I know has a couple of half-finished pieces that they'll never finish. I'll bet he dropped some of these in the book just as an excuse to get them out there somewhere. And then, as far as I can tell, you didn't. You resist any urge you might have had to salt the book with lots of lyrics from the different bands that you named.
Well, there is a point when Reed is rewriting that song called "Can't Never Go Back." What is it called? It's called "You Can't Never Go Back to Where You Can't Get Away From," and he's rewriting the song. And the original of the song has this hound dog that has a lot of ticks, and that's from a song that I was writing for a friend of mine for her bat mitzvah. The line was that, so I can't remember what it rhymes with, licks or kicks or something like that, but I hope she has more blessings than a hound dog has ticks, and that's part of the original part of the song. And then later on, when Reed's writing it, he puts the ticks on his girlfriend's pet rat, and just goes on into various places we don't have to worry about right now.
I was curious because it is compartmentalization of your writing career, in a sense, that the book is not affecting the lyrics, and from what it sounds like, these are separate containers in your mind, and they're not doing as much crossover as I would have expected. I was figuring that when you were writing a book in which big chunks of it are set in a particular era, you might come up with some music that would reflect that era yourself, just because you were living in it for a while, you were immersed in it.
Well, there is a bit of a through line. In different chapters, the characters are hearing different songs that were popular at that time, which do relate to the plot that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
There's a place where they're listening to Paul Simon's 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover after that's happened. And I play with that a lot. There must be like 6 or 8 different places where they're listening to music that was actually popular at the time that does relate to what's going on in the plot.
Well, that's not anything that unusual, because as surrounded by and immersed in music as just about everyone in this community was, I'm saying the music community of Greater Los Angeles, there was music everywhere, and sooner or later you were going to be walking down the street feeling sad, and something was going to come blasting out of someone's car that was like, ooh, that was a stab in the back of where I am right now. Or something similar was going to happen, because there was so much music that was so emotional. It was an overwrought era in a certain way.
And these characters, music is their language. Like there's a point there where Reed and Angie have separated, and he hears a tune that's been released, and he can tell by the horn charts that it's her work there. That's their language. That's their language of love or hate or whatever.
Language of love or hate. I can definitely think of some musicians who use music to get back at ex-lovers of theirs, to really slam them. And I'm sure if you were that person when you heard that song, you knew they were talking about you, because they worked that in.
There was that John Lennon song he wrote to Paul McCartney about how can you sleep at night from the crap you're writing. You know that song?
No. What?
It's on, I think it's called How Can You Sleep at Night. It's on I can't remember which, it's one of the early John Lennon solo albums, and it's clearly just aimed right at Paul McCartney.
Well, there actually is a song that you can, a later piece than that, if you happen to remember, a soft rock song called How Long Has This Been Going On?
Sure.
Which, everybody listens to that and thinks it's about a broken love relationship. Do you know what that song was really about? Mm-hmm. the lead singer discovered that everybody else in the band had been rehearsing with a different singer and were about to kick him out of the band. And so he wrote that, when he sang that song for his band, he was facing that band with accusing them. And that became their only hit.
That is too rich.
Anyway, you've been living in music for so long, and what do you, after writing about these passionate people who start out mostly as passionate amateurs, in an era when radio play and media were the gods of everything, and now here we are in the YouTube generation where anybody who has composed something on their computer can get it out and the entire world can hear it. In your recording sessions, when they're recording for someone who's a label executive, it's like one of the gods have come down to earth and is here, and we don't have that anymore. Label executives have no power. Anybody can be a label executive because, So what do you have as thoughts about, any thoughts about how that would affect anyone trying to write about music in the future? Could a book like this be written, about the current era where you're writing about YouTube influencers and where there isn't the rigid control over the market?
I'd love to read that book. That sounds fascinating. I'm certainly not the one to write it. I mean, you have somebody like Billie Eilish who records in her bedroom and then is playing arenas. It's just a mind-boggling change there.
Yeah, there's an artist that I've been following since the late 70s out of Britain called the Bevis Frond. He actually was in a car accident that nearly immobilized him, and just out of sheer boredom decided to make albums where he recorded all of the instruments without leaving his room, because basically he couldn't. And he now has a 40-year music career in which almost everything he's done, he's played all of the instruments. A while ago, he decided he wasn't that good of a drummer, so he has another drummer, but he plays everything else. And then when he announced that he was touring, everybody thought it was a joke. It's like, what are you doing, karaokeing your own stuff? And it's like, no, he had secretly put together a band and taken it out, and he produced some excellent work, but it was just shocking, the idea that you could do this live. That's someone who's been following that, who was leading that train before a lot of other people knew it existed. Todd Rundgren released an album called Something Anything, where 3 sides of the album he played all of the instruments and sang, and on the 4th side of the album he got a group of musicians, threw them in a room together and gave them no rehearsal. It was first take everything. And there were 2 hits from that album, one of which, a song called Hello, It's Me, was done on the first take side. Those musicians had never heard that before. He passed out charts, they did it, and then moved on to the next song. Some of the stuff on that 4th side is not very good, but some of it became his big hits. So.
Dylan likes to record that way, I understand. Just first take, whatever happens.
That's someone who I was going to ask about, who is mostly absent from What Goes Around. Did you ever play with him? Or
No, I never.
What Goes Around, from Musical Mavericks, swerving to the other club.
He has a brief time there. I mean, I didn't play with him, but I knew him. He was around the scene for a while. My dad presented him in concert a couple of times, and I took advantage to hang out in the dressing room. And there was one time I remember when we were leaving the concerts, the first time that I actually saw what that side of celebrity was like, because it was Dylan and Joan Baez and Eric von Schmidt and me were leaving the concert in a van, and there were all these rabid fans who wanted a piece of Dylan, and we had to kind of hunker down so that they wouldn't see us. First time I actually saw that part of it all.
Well, I hope you saw it many other times during your career, and maybe you'll see it again. Any project that you're working on now that is a literary project, or is it just going to be if lightning strikes and another thing happens?
Well, given the actuarial tables, I'm 80 years old. I really don't think I have another novel in me. I'd like to explore a short story, but I'm not a person who has, a zillion ideas and has to pick one of them. I have to grunt my way through getting one idea to fruition. And right now I'm more into performing. I've got some more gigs coming up, and that's going to be the focus for a while. But I do enjoy writing, and I like. I think it's all storytelling in one way or the other, whether you're singing a song or writing a story. We're storytellers. That goes back to Homer, and I think it's going to last forever, no matter how much the technology changes.
That seems like as good a place to end on this as anything. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.